began with a phone call at 3:17 in the morning. Not a diplomatic exchange, not a polite request, but an ultimatum. 48 hours. 2 days to reverse contracts, to restore surveillance deals, to hand back sovereignty as if it were a borrowed object. A small, landlocked nation of 22 million was told to choose between exile and submission. But in that moment of pressure, when the line went silent and the clock began to tick, something far greater stirred. For this was not just about one president. It was about the meaning of independence itself. Would the soil of Burkina Faso become once again a playground for foreign power? Or would it become the seedbed of dignity for a new generation? The leader who received that call did not tremble. He did not bend. He chose clarity over fear, resistance over surrender. Stay with us. This is not a headline, it is a turning point. Subscribe, walk with the story, and witness how 48 hours could change the destiny of a continent. Because the question remains, if one African nation can refuse, what stops the rest? The countdown had begun, but the real story was still to unfold. The room was still dark when the call came, but its words illuminated the deepest fault lines of global politics. At 3:17 in the morning, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, issued his decree. 48 hours to restore mining concessions, to reinstate surveillance contracts, to bow before interests that had long fed on Africa's soil. The line cut, but the echo of domination remained. It was not the first time an African leader had been told to obey or be removed. History carried scars of such demands, coups masked as cooperation, loans disguised as generosity, contracts written in foreign capitals, yet paid for by African sweat. But never before had it been said so bluntly, so shamelessly, abandon your people or surrender your office. Inside the presidential residence in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence. Once a soldier in the Sahel, he had faced jihadist ambushes and nights when death crouched behind every dune. Yet this was different. The enemy here was not unseen militants in the desert, but the cold calculation of global power. And the weapon was not rifles or bombs. It was economic isolation, political delegitimization, the slow strangling of sovereignty. The call was repeated half an hour later. Same voice, sharper tone. Step down voluntarily or be removed involuntarily. This time the response was granite. I do not negotiate with extortionists. I do not bow to bullies. And I certainly do not abandon my people because a foreign power demands it. The phone clicked. Defiance had been spoken into the night. Within an hour, the inner circle was summoned. The defense minister, the intelligence chief, the advisor on foreign affairs, the trusted few who had lived through turmoil and coups. Around the table in the crisis room, the recordings were played. Netanyahu's words reverberated against the walls. Restore our contracts, surrender your office, 48 hours. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. This is not policy pressure, the defense minister finally said. This is regime change. Intelligence confirmed what many had suspected. Unusual satellite surveillance over Ouagadougou. Cyber intrusions probing the state's digital nervous system. Financial movements suggesting funding for unrest. This was not a threat in isolation. It was the opening act of a well-rehearsed play. Options were laid out like weapons on a table. Accept the demands, step down, hope to be allowed to leave the country alive. Or resist, not militarily, for that battle could not be won against such an adversary, but in every other arena. Economic, digital, psychological, diplomatic. Traoré stood and approached the map of Burkina Faso hanging on the wall. A small, landlocked nation. No nuclear arsenal, no superpower fleet, only its people and their will to stand upright. He traced the rivers with his finger, the roads that linked villages to towns, the soil that had been tilled for generations. Sometimes refusal is enough, he said quietly. That refusal became strategy. Calls were placed, not to beg for rescue, but to weave an alliance. Caracas, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing. Leaders who knew the taste of pressure, who had once faced ultimatums and chosen to resist. Each responded with varying offers: political asylum, cyber defenses, economic partnerships, advisors. It was not salvation, but it was solidarity. Meanwhile, whispers of the ultimatum spread through Ouagadougou like fire through dry grass. Radio stations carried fragments of the threat. By dawn, the ultimatum had become public knowledge, not through government disclosure, but through leaks from the very foreign agents who had issued it. Crowds gathered, first in anger, then in resolve. Placards appeared with messages scrawled in haste. Our resources are not for sale. 48 hours? Try 48 years. The presidency, the INC, once the loneliest seat in the nation, became the focal point of unity. Traders closed shops to join marches. Students filled the streets with chants. Elders told stories of past struggles, reminding the young that dignity, once surrendered, is never easily reclaimed. The ultimatum had been intended to isolate a leader. Instead, it had mobilized a people. What had been whispered at 3 in the morning now roared at midday. Burkina Faso would not bend. But the pressure was only beginning, and the next hours would test not just one man's resolve, but the resilience of an entire nation. The clock ticked on, each hour carved deeper into the 48. By dawn, the ultimatum was no longer a private threat whispered down secure lines. It was a public challenge broadcast on airwaves and carried in chants. And once a nation knows its dignity has been threatened, silence is no longer possible. In the presidential crisis room, the atmosphere was taut as a drawn bowstring. Reports arrived in quick succession. Unmarked satellites adjusting orbits. Interference detected on government servers. Anonymous transfers flooding neighboring states, seeding unrest through proxy groups. They are not waiting for the 48 hours to expire, the intelligence chief warned. They are already preparing your removal. The defense minister's words cut sharper. This is not about contracts. This is the rehearsal of a coup without tanks. Economic siege. Digital blackouts. Propaganda storms. When it erupts, it will look like chaos from within, but its architects sit far away. Yet even as the circle acknowledged the threat, Traoré refused to spare. He turned once again to the map, his finger tracing the veins of the land. They think fear will break us, but fear, when shared, becomes fire. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou swelled. What foreign analysts might call instability was, in truth, solidarity. Market women abandoned their stalls to chant in unison. Youth painted slogans on walls. Our minerals are not your property. Students banged drums, each strike echoing the countdown clock. The ultimatum had tried to shrink one man into submission. Instead, it enlarged an entire people into resistance. By hour 20, Traoré was engaged in a diplomatic marathon. Video calls lit the palace screens. Caracas offered political sanctuary, not as escape, but as insurance. Tehran's voice promised countermeasures in cyberspace, pledging to shield networks from intrusion. Moscow's response was pragmatic. Advisors ready if escalation demanded. Beijing proposed new economic corridors to replace Western investments. Each promise was imperfect, but together they formed a lifeline woven from defiance. As midnight approached again, news of the ultimatum reached every radio in Burkina Faso. Farmers in remote villages gathered around crackling sets, listening not with dread but with disbelief at the arrogance of foreign command. Step down, one elder asked aloud. Step where? This is his soil. Where should he step but here? Then came hour 30. The phone rang again. Netanyahu's voice was colder, more calculated. 18 hours remain. Do not let your people suffer for your pride. But this time the response was measured steel. You misunderstand, Prime Minister. It is not my pride that resists. It is my people's will. You tried to appoint their president from abroad without asking them. Look out of my window. The streets are filled. They have answered for themselves. The words carried beyond the palace. They became headlines, hashtags, chants that spread across cities. In Bobo Dioulasso, tens of thousands marched with banners declaring, "No foreign surveillance in Burkina Faso." In Kaya, a choir of schoolchildren sang, 48 hours will never break 48 years of struggle. By hour 36, the pressure mounted. Banks faltered under cyber assault. Power grids flickered. Disinformation flooded phones, fabricated videos, forged documents, false claims of presidential flight. But for every shadow, a counterlight emerged. Backup servers activated. Distributed generators kept the lights burning. Encrypted channels sustained communication. Volunteers debunked fake news within minutes, holding the line of truth. The intelligence chief entered the room, urgency etched on his face. They are no longer just attacking you, sir. They are attacking the very concept of African independence. He displayed Western headlines, democratic backsliding in West Africa. Strongman defies international order. The message was clear. Resistance was to be branded as authoritarianism. Yet in this inversion, a turning point emerged. At hour 40, calls arrived from African capitals. Mali's president, if they can topple you, they can topple us all. Niger's parliament, a resolution condemning interference. Ghana's leader, an emergency AU session. Chad's generals, high alert, mutual defense. The ultimatum had sought to isolate. Instead, it had unified. Africa was no longer a collection of fragmented states waiting for instruction. It was becoming a chorus, a resistance of nations. Hour 45. 3 hours to deadline. The phone rang for the final time. But the voice had changed, no longer commands, but negotiation. Perhaps we can find a solution. Your resignation is not necessary if, Traore cut across, steady as ever. 3 hours ago, perhaps you had a partner. But you made two errors, threatening a people's democracy and underestimating the continent's response. I ask nothing of you except this, except that Africa is sovereign. The silence that followed was the sound of a bluff collapsing. Yet the countdown had not ended. The final 3 hours would decide not just the fate of a president, but whether Africa itself could withstand the weight of ultimatum. When the 40th hour passed, Burkina Faso was no longer just bracing for a storm. It was already inside one. Banks faltered under invisible pressure. Power grids flickered with uncertainty, and radio waves carried both truth and falsehood in equal measure. The ultimatum was not merely a diplomatic note. It had become a battlefield stretched across the daily lives of 22 million people. Shops closed early, not out of fear but out of solidarity. Families gathered around radios, waiting for news, waiting to see whether their country would bend or break. Children carried handmade banners, their paint still wet, declaring that no foreign power could choose their future. The air was heavy with tension, yet it pulsed with something else too: defiance. The disinformation campaign struck hardest. Videos emerged showing government officials allegedly calling for resignation. Forged documents accused the president of holding secret accounts in Switzerland. Social media was flooded with whispers that the head of state had already fled. But truth fought back. Within minutes, fact-checkers and citizens armed with smartphones debunked the lies. A fabricated bank slip was compared to real forms and dismissed. A staged video was revealed as a poor imitation with mismatched lips. Each lie exposed became fuel for greater anger. In the countryside, farmers gathered under baobab trees, discussing not only the ultimatum, but what it represented. If they can force our president to leave, one farmer said, then tomorrow they can force us to sell our land. If we surrender today, there will be no tomorrow worth living. It was this grassroots clarity that became the shield of the nation. Meanwhile, the political machinery in Ouagadougou braced itself. Parliament debated through the night, not whether to comply, but how to prepare for fallout. Opposition figures who had once criticized the president now declared, "Our quarrels are domestic, but foreign ultimatums are unacceptable." For a brief moment, political lines dissolved, and the idea of sovereignty stood above faction. The strain was undeniable. Markets wavered. The national currency threatened collapse under speculation. Prices for food and fuel climbed. Yet the streets did not demand surrender. They demanded resistance. "Better hunger with dignity than feast with chains," one placard read. Inside the palace, the president conferred with his advisors. "They are not only attacking me," he said. "They are attacking the very concept of African democracy. If I step down, I will be remembered as the man who surrendered a people's dignity. If I resist, even if I fall, I will be remembered as the man who refused." The intelligence chief warned of escalating tactics. "Sir, we expect orchestrated unrest. They will try to turn the people against you with staged riots." But the opposite unfolded. When rumors spread of planned demonstrations demanding resignation, tens of thousands instead appeared demanding resistance. The foreign script had been torn and a new one written by Burkina Faso hands. This was the moment the phrase Ibrahim Traoré Coup entered the international vocabulary. Commentators in Western capitals whispered that his defiance would trigger instability, that his government would collapse under pressure. Yet on the ground, the opposite occurred. Rather than a coup against him, it became a coup against the very logic of foreign domination. His refusal was not weakness, it was the consolidation of legitimacy. The political consequences spread quickly. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a peripheral state, became the epicenter of a continental debate. Could African democracy withstand foreign ultimatums? Could sovereignty outlast economic warfare? The African Union convened an emergency discussion, and for the first time in years, leaders who had long remained silent spoke openly of their own pressures. "If they can threaten Ouagadougou today," one minister declared, "they will threaten Abuja, Accra, and Dakar tomorrow." Yet within this storm of speeches and sanctions, it was the people who carried the heaviest weight. Markets unstable, services disrupted, uncertainty thick as dust, but the spirit unbroken. From student rallies to union halls, from mosques to churches, the refrain was the same. No ultimatum will choose our future. And so, as the deadline approached, the nation stood paradoxically weakened in material terms, yet strengthened in spirit. Roads bore fewer cars because fuel was scarce, but more voices because protests filled the air. Banks held less cash, but families held tighter to each other. It was not the image foreign analysts expected to see. They had predicted panic, collapse, a scramble for safety. Instead, they saw unity, resilience, a refusal that spread like roots beneath dry soil. But even as the people resisted, the world beyond Burkina Faso was stirring, and the ultimatum was about to become a continental affair. By the time the ultimatum reached its 40th hour, the question was no longer confined to Ouagadougou. It had spilled across borders, into conference halls, and onto television screens worldwide. What began as a private command from one leader to another was now a litmus test for the entire international order. The African Union responded first. Ministers gathered in an emergency session, their voices sharper than usual diplomatic tones. Ghana's delegate declared, "If Burkina Faso falls to an ultimatum today, tomorrow it will be the rest of us." Mali's representative warned, "The precedent of forcing contracts through coercion cannot be allowed." In Addis Ababa, the language shifted from caution to solidarity. For the first time in years, the AU was not merely condemning in principle, it was preparing in practice. ECOWAS, often divided, also found unusual clarity. Some leaders feared instability, others saw an opportunity for continental assertion. Yet even among skeptics, one truth resonated. The ultimatum was less about contracts than about control. And control, once conceded, is rarely recovered. Across the Mediterranean, reactions diverged. In Brussels, the European Union issued statements of concern couched in bureaucratic phrases: stability, democracy, regional order. But between the lines was unease. If one African leader could defy, others might follow. In Paris, commentators fretted over shrinking influence in West Africa. Editorials warned of a new wave of anti-Western populism, though what they called populism was in truth sovereignty. Washington weighed its words carefully. Publicly, officials spoke of the need for restraint and dialogue. Privately, cables revealed anxiety. The United States had long balanced its rhetoric of democracy with its reliance on strategic partnerships. An African president openly resisting external dictates complicated that balance. Could Washington condemn interference without undermining an ally? Could it support sovereignty without risking alliances? The contradictions sharpened by the ultimatum exposed fault lines in American policy. Israel itself faced unusual scrutiny. Headlines from Al Jazeera to the BBC covered the recordings that had leaked. Was it true that a foreign prime minister had ordered the resignation of an elected African president? Israeli officials neither confirmed nor denied, but the silence spoke volumes. For a government accustomed to shaping narratives, the absence of denial fueled global speculation. Meanwhile, support flowed from unexpected quarters. Latin America echoed with statements of solidarity, recalling their own history of ultimatums tied to resources. In Caracas, Nicolás Maduro hailed Burkina Faso's defiance as a beacon for the global south. In Tehran, leaders described it as resistance diplomacy. Moscow offered pragmatic backing. Beijing hinted at economic partnerships. Each had their own interests, but together they formed a counterpoint to Western pressure. It was in this swirl of reactions that the phrase Burkina Faso Revolution surfaced in commentary. Analysts debated whether this defiance was an isolated outburst or the spark of something larger. In African streets, it was not analysis but anthem. If one small nation can resist, what stops the rest? But the deadline still ticked towards zero, and the final hours would decide whether solidarity remained words or became history. When the final hours slipped away and the ultimatum expired, something irreversible had taken place. Burkina Faso still stood. Its president had not fled. Its people had not broken. Its sovereignty had not been signed away. And yet the true significance was not survival alone. It was what survival meant for the future. The road ahead stretched like a path after rainfall, muddy, uneven, but alive with growth. The first question was immediate: what next? Foreign powers would not abandon their interests simply because one ultimatum failed. Pressure would continue through trade, through loans, through narratives carefully planted in international media. But the balance had shifted. For the first time in decades, an African nation had not merely endured, but had reversed the logic of power. The risks were clear. Economic isolation could tighten. Investments might dry up. Aid could be withdrawn with political strings attached. And yet with each risk came opportunity. Partnerships once unthinkable were now possible. New corridors of trade with Asia, Latin America, and within Africa itself. Cooperative defense against cyber threats. A continental push for communication satellites, independent currencies, and the infrastructure to speak with one voice. For the people of Burkina Faso, the road ahead was not without hardship. Inflation nipped at households. Jobs trembled under uncertainty. But pride has its own nourishment. The chants that filled the capital. 48 hours? Try 48 years became more than protest slogans. They became a collective identity, a refusal to measure dignity in foreign contracts or external approval. For Africa as a whole, the ultimatum planted a seed. Leaders who had once bowed silently began to calculate differently. If Burkina Faso could resist, why not Mali? If Mali could resist, why not Niger? Sovereignty, once treated as symbolic, was being reimagined as practical. And sovereignty, when lived, changes not only politics but psychology. The future held challenges as sharp as thorns. How to balance resistance with dialogue. How to secure independence without drifting into isolation. How to unite a continent whose colonial borders had long encouraged division. These were not questions for one man or one nation. They were questions for a generation. And yet, hope outweighed despair. In schools, children recited the story of those 48 hours. In parliaments, lawmakers cited them as precedent. In streets across Africa, young people spoke of dignity as if it were not an abstract principle, but a tangible inheritance. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was their road. And that made all the difference. But even this was not the end. For what began in a midnight phone call was destined to echo far beyond, into the story of a continent reclaiming its place in the world. When the sun rose on the 49th hour, the ultimatum was no more than an empty shadow. The phone calls had ended, the threats had expired, yet something remained, a truth that could not be silenced. Burkina Faso still belonged to Burkinabe hands, and its people had discovered that sovereignty is not a gift to be granted, but a choice to be defended. This was never only about one president or one country. It was about whether African democracy was real or merely performance. It was about whether dignity could outlast pressure, whether freedom could withstand fear. And for 2 days, the world had watched a test. The result was clear. Ultimatums hold power only if accepted. Refuse and they dissolve like smoke. The story became more than national survival. It became continental inspiration. Across Africa, students spoke of those hours as a turning point. Across Latin America and Asia, leaders cited them as precedent. Even in the corridors of Western power, policymakers admitted, privately if not publicly, that the logic of command had been shaken. This moment will not be remembered for its threats, but for its refusal. The Ibrahim Traoré coup that was expected by foreign capitals never materialized. Instead, it was a coup against the very assumption that Africa must bow when ordered. And in its place emerged something stronger, a Burkina Faso revolution of spirit, carried not only by soldiers or ministers, but by ordinary people who refuse to surrender their future. The question that remains is not whether Burkina Faso can endure. It already has. The question is what comes next? For Mali, for Niger, for Ghana, for every nation told to choose between aid and dignity, between pressure and partnership. If one small country can resist, what stops the rest? Stay with us, for this is not just the end of one story, but the opening of many. Subscribe, share, and add your voice to a community that believes in freedom without permission, in dignity without condition, in sovereignty without apology. 48 hours were meant to bring surrender. Instead, they brought awakening, and that awakening continues.